Good morning, folks. Gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the second Learning with Games session. The first one was yesterday afternoon. I'm delighted that so many people have managed to find their way to this room, first of all. That was the first challenge. And you'll also be very pleased to know there's more people in this room than there are next door, because I've just checked. So I think you should be very pleased about that. Not that naturally gamers are competitive, are they, in any particular way? My name's Ollie Bray, and it's my job to kind of chair this session this morning and also to do a little bit of an introduction. And we've got 5 other great speakers to speak to you this morning. And I think you're going to really like what they're going to say. Lots of really great stuff in terms of sort of classroom practice, working with children, and lots of real things that are sort of really going on now and things that we can take from that as well. So it's my job sort of initially to kind of introduce the slot. And then in about sort of 30 minutes time, I'll introduce the other speakers. We've got two sessions before the break and then 3 sessions after the break as well. And during the morning, please feel free to come and go. We like to keep these things sort of fairly laid back. And if the only reason that you're here is because we put out on Twitter that you're going to get a free iPod, that wasn't true, I'm afraid. All right? So I'm sorry about that. Okay. So just a little bit of background about myself is that I work for Learning and Teaching Scotland. I was sort of quite conscious yesterday that there was a little bit of sort of talk about LTS, but we didn't really kind of explain what it is for the people from England and Wales. So the best way to describe it, I guess, is that LTS is kind of a combination between the QCA and BECTA in Scotland. So we're responsible for schools ICT, but we're also responsible for the curriculum as well. And the specific project that I work for is the Consolarium project, which is basically to do with games-based learning and innovation in Scottish schools. And the project's been in existence now for about 3.5 years. It's led by Derek Robertson, who did the keynote yesterday morning, and there are now sort of 5 full-time members of staff working specifically on that project. And if you've got any questions about that and the kind of journey that we've been on, please feel free to stop us during the break or at any point today, and we'd be delighted to talk to you about that or to share this practice. Now, last night, you may have seen there were a number of people that maybe had a little bit to drink. And the great thing, isn't it, about being social, just like games are social, is that we start to talk about things and we start to talk about practice. And I thought it would just be really useful just to kind of explain where you can find us online, because there were a lot of people asking these questions yesterday. And I think it's really important, isn't it? So in terms of the Consolarium, if you use Twitter, then that's one of the best ways to kind of track us. Now, we don't really follow anybody on Twitter, but this aggregates everything that we do. So any blog posts, any podcasts, any Twitter feeds that come out from the team, if we're out working in schools, it all kind of gets aggregated through here. So if you use Twitter, you can follow that. If you don't use Twitter, you can just go to that website and you can kind of see a chronology of what we're up to around Scotland and vice versa. And the latest service that we've offered as well is this kind of podcast, which goes out bi-weekly, which talks specifically about games-based learning, some of the people that we've met and some of the success stories. And we've been busy recording, some interviews with practitioners from all around the world, really, from this conference, and hopefully they'll be going out over the next few weeks as well. So just incredibly keen to share, and even though that this is a project funded by LTS and the Scottish Government, we would like it to be wider, because that's the best thing that we can do, isn't it, is try and share some of these things. And the last thing I just want to show you there is the website. And the reason that I flagged that up is because from that website there, we've also got a blog, and any of the presentations that you'll see from anybody from LTS this morning will be going up online. So any of the slides, any of the links that we mentioned, or anything like that, we'll all put it up online. There's nothing more frustrating, is there, that when you go to a conference and somebody puts up a really good website and you think that's going to absolutely transform my classroom practice, and you're busy sort of scribbling the website address down, and then the presenter moves on to the next slide, just as you've got to the 16th backslash as it goes along. And we're very conscious of that. So anything that we say, any part of our work, we'll put up online, copies of the slides, take it, use it, pretend it's your own, because we're very much in the culture of sharing here. And that kind of got me thinking a little bit about, what we would do a few years ago if we were sharing conference slides. And probably what we would have done is we would have printed them out, put them in conference plaques, destroyed half of the Brazilian rainforest in the process, and you would never have looked at these slides again. And it's really interesting, isn't it, that the way that we deliver and work with conferences now is really to do with change. And the way that we work in education now as well, I think that change is a really kind of important word. And I think one thing for me that was coming out of the conference yesterday was this whole idea of storytelling, and that how games are driven by narrative, but also the kind of power of stories. And I was just kind of thinking to myself this morning as I was thinking about these slides, I was thinking about that word change, and I was thinking about the word storytelling. And I was thinking, well, how have we changed how young people interact with stories? over time. And I think this is interesting because a girl there, stood next to 100 books in a library in Prestwick High School, yet now actually, she can get 100 books on a Nintendo DS for £10, and some very, very forward-thinking schools are thinking, well, for £10, and we know that 70% of our kids have got Nintendo DSs, why don't we put some copies of this game or other narrative-driven games, into the library so that children can kind of interact with this? And it kind of got me thinking about change and how we interacted with stories. And then this is a kind of fantastic product, I think, where you can actually kind of insert your iPhone or your iPod Touch into a book. And it works kind of just like a book, and you can kind of flick it through, and you still read the text in exactly the same way as you interact with the text as you would do normally. But also you can turn on audio, and obviously the touch screen interface within the iPhone or the iPod Touch allows you to interact with the story as well. Maybe kind of making things a little bit more blurred between what is a text, and what is a game, or are they actually kind of the same? And these are some points that I want to pick up on this morning. So during this presentation then, hopefully I'm going to pick up on the key points that I took from yesterday's conference, tie that into some of the work that we've been doing. I want to provide a little bit of a thought piece as well in terms of where I think games are going, particularly games in school, and also link to some of the other presentations that we've got coming into this for this morning, which I'm very, very excited about. I know many of the presenters very well, and I know that they're going to do a fantastic job. So I thought I would kind of start here, and that's with this question of why games, because it's an interesting time, really, isn't it? Because some people, like us probably, because we're at this conference, are absolutely convinced that games-based learning is a good thing in schools. Yet when we go back to our schools, sometimes it's quite difficult to actually convince other people within our schools, other school leaders, other education authorities, to kind of adopt this pedagogy in terms of what we do. But I was really sort of struck by this quote when I first met Derek a number of years ago, when he kind of said, well, good teachers use good tools. And, I think that this sums it up perfectly, because if we think about it, what is a game? Well, game is play. And if you're at the Teach Meet last night, Stephen Heppel talks not about games-based learning, but playful learning, which I think is a really, really good way to kind of describe it. And I think that good teachers have always used good tools, and I think that play and playful learning has always been a good tool. And if we look at the kind of evolution of play, perhaps from traditional play to slightly more mechanicalised to games consoles, I'm not saying there's not any place for anything on the left-hand side of the screen, because I think that we need a completely blended approach, but I think that what we've got here is we've got a paradigm shift, is that young people are playing in different ways, and we need to kind of capitalise on some of the work of games and some of the work of consoles to really kind of engage them in their learning. And I also think that if we're talking about learning, then what do we really need to get a child to learn? Well, first of all, I think we need good pedagogy. And I think that was a really key point that was coming across from many of the sessions yesterday. You can't just put a young person in front of a game in an educational context, because they're not going to learn the maximum amount out of it. In order for them to get the maximum amount out of it, we still need the teacher there, to drive the learning, to drive what's going forwards. And I think also for good learning to take place, we need to provide these kind of interesting and engaging activities. And I think that by its very definition, technology or new technology is engaging. And this is a great example, I think, of new technology. Right? And I mean that. Right? I'm not talking about ICT here, but this is a great example of new technology. Right? When in my school, we were looking to improve the achievement of the pupils in maths. We bought 30 very, very small whiteboards and pens because they'd suddenly become a lot more affordable. They weren't available on the market anymore. Right? And suddenly we had a very, very kind of cheap interactive voting system. Yeah, suddenly that kind of learning became a lot more playful, and the children got a huge amount out of it. And just like any new technology, if we look at that, it was highly appropriate for that particular reason, just like games can be highly appropriate, sometimes or computer games can be highly appropriate. It was highly accessible for all the children, they could all interact with it, just like many children can now interact with computer games because they've got them at home, and also it was highly affordable as well. And when we look at these COTS titles, these commercially off-the-shelf titles that we were talking about so much yesterday, these now are also highly appropriate, highly accessible, and highly affordable in some circumstances as well. So it's not just kind of about computer games, it's about new technology and getting young people to engage with this. But sticking with computer games for a minute is that I don't just think they're kind of about learning or getting knowledge from them. I also think they're really about kind of driving social interaction as well. And that's a real challenge for a teacher, to use a computer game to get that kind of social interaction between students. But actually, it works really well, because many of you here will be gamers, and we all know that actually many games are kind of competitive, but they're also kind of non-threatening. And that's a really, really good thing if you can capitalise on that in the classroom. Because a young person seems to find it quite comfortable to be able to kind of lose at a game, and there's not a lot of stigma attached to that. But if you only get 5 out of 20 in maths, all right, then they don't like to lose at maths. So, you know, as a sort of talented classroom teacher, as someone to sort of try and make the links between that gaming world, you know, and the online world, you know, why don't we sort of try and draw some parallels there? Why don't we explain to the children that actually it's okay to get 5 out of 20 in maths, as long as you go back and you replay that level, and you get better and better and better, and you don't give up in exactly the same way as you would do, you know, with your computer game. So it's about structuring the learning, you know, and taking these things from the world of the child, you know, and putting them into the kind of real context within school. And I think the last thing where we should talk about sort of social interaction in games is this whole business between transition time. And in Scotland, we've got a 3 to 18 curriculum, which I'm very, very pleased about. But we've got some key stages of transition where children move between nursery and primary, from the primary into the secondary school, and then on to positive destinations. And again, I think that games have got a real place here. And Brian McLaren, who's speaking after the break, is going to be talking about a transition project where they're using the Sony iPads to make that transition link from the nursery phase into the primary phase. We've talked about Guitar Hero a lot, you know, at this conference and at previous conferences, but how that's been used, again, to link between the primary and the secondary phase. And there's some great displays outside, you know, which are basically talking about what some people call serious games, you know, which really link school to that world of sort of positive destinations, helping children prepare for trades and other things like other things like that. So thinking about how games can be used, I think, at important stages in terms of transition. And let's just go back to that's a slide that I showed sort of previously before, which was that game where I was talking about games being non-competitive, competitive but non-threatening. And that was a game called Spore. All right? I don't know whether you've ever played Spore before, but it's a fantastic game, and it's being used very, very successfully, you know, in some Aberdeenshire schools as a kind of contextual hub for learning to teach about biology. Because what Spore is it's basically a game about evolution, where you take a character from that kind of bacterial stage and you trace that all the way up into colonizing a planet and even then going to colonize other planets as well. But one of the wonderful things about it, in terms of low cost and appropriate, is you can download this free creature creator where children can actually kind of make their own creatures and think about how these creatures might survive in different environments as well. You know, so really, really sort of quite engaging, you know, for young people, these free tools and something that they can relate with in a real kind of social context. And that brings me nicely onto this kind of idea of kind of contextual hubs. And, you know, what we mean by a contextual hub is, you know, something that I would call the Star Trek principle. Now, I don't pretend to be a Trekkie for any means of the imagination. I'm not. But do you remember that? Remember the original Star Trek series with Spock and Captain Kirk and all these people? And Captain Kirk always ended up with a woman, you know, after every episode and these sort of things. And pretty much, you know, Star Trek, the original Star Trek series was a program about space travel, right? Or lots of people thought it was a program about space travel. Yeah. But actually, if you look at a lot of the scripts to do with Star Trek, yes, it was set in space. But really, just like most good modern soap operas, it was actually a program about moral issues. And there was some pretty risky TV on Star Trek. So, for example, if you research the history of Star Trek, the first interracial kiss ever televised took place on a Star Trek episode. All right? And what's my point? Well, my point is this. My point is that sometimes, if we're talking about contextual hubs, it's highly appropriate to make the children think that they're doing a project about a computer game. Yeah? But actually, the project is about completely other things as well. Yeah? It's about the teacher driving the learning, but providing that kind of real, rich context to kind of create that environment in. And talented classroom teachers, you know, creative classroom teachers are able to take things like computer games, and they're able to think about them, and they're able to think, how can I relate this game, and how can I make this game, you know, fit into the curriculum? And for me, this is one of the points that I took from yesterday. I mean, I absolutely loved Made in Me. Right, I thought it was, you know, I thought it was really, really good, and I thought this was a great quote. That in order to engage the learners, we need to engage the teachers first. Right, and I think that's a really, really important point because there are a lot of teachers that aren't gamers. Right, but if we can get them engaged in technology, actually, computer games are a very, very accessible form of technology, and we're just kind of providing the link. So again, it's coming back to this idea of making people think a little bit differently. So let's take a technology, right? Microsoft Worldwide Telescope, right? Which is free, which is available to all. You can do it with Google Sky, all of these things. You know, you can get the whole of the solar system right on your desktop. Now, obviously, that's highly appropriate for teaching about the solar system, astronomy, maths, numeracy, all of these things. But we should be, as creative teachers, looking at that and saying, yeah, it's great for maths, it's great for numeracy, and it's great for teaching physics, but isn't it just as appropriate to teach creative writing? To get the children to think about, well, what would it be like to live on that planet? What would it feel like? Who would you meet? What would it smell like? You know, how are you going to get there? What's your space journey going to be? Design your spaceship in order to get there. So looking at one thing that's built for one thing and then thinking about it, you know, something else. This is another great example. Great way to get teachers on board and using technology, right? Bing. Now, I'm not suggesting use it for searching or finding things. You could use whichever search engine you want, right? But every day, you can guarantee on Bing, there's always going to be a nice, really, really powerful image, which is going to be child-friendly, which you can show to your class. And what's the great thing about Bing? Well, hidden within Bing, as well as it's a search engine of these little kind of hotspots that you've got here. So Microsoft, without even knowing it, right, have provided you with this kind of really, really nice image and an interactive mystery, right, which you can use as your lesson starter, which you can use to discuss things. And of course, we could look at maybe an image here from Gavin Primary School, and Gillian Penny was speaking yesterday, you know, and somebody might look at that and they might think, huh, you know, what are those children doing playing the Nintendo Wii in class? What a waste of time, right? But of course, a creative teacher would look at that and say, isn't it great that those children are playing that 1.5-minute game about speed skating so that they can collect their maths data for the lesson? Right? So it's getting real data from some of these games and then applying that to the learning, taking one thing, you know, and thinking slightly differently. And that's what we need to do with some of these kind of like commercially available off-the-shelf titles, right? And there are many, many of these games that we've used in Scotland and many of these games that are now being used, you know, all over the country really, which have been built for entertainment and they can be retrofitted for education. They can be used as this kind of contextual hub, which can be used to link literacy, numeracy, creative writing, social subjects, science, all of these things together. And the only thing that it requires in order for us to do this, you know, is a little bit of imagination. Now, the other thing about games is how I think they provide a common language. And by common language is that I mean that some of those games that I showed you before, they're played by children all over the world. Now, the actual text might be different, it might be in a different language, but the actual game is the same. The gameplay is the same, the objectives, you know, are the same. So actually, you know, when we talk about kind of social interaction, you know, games are really, really good ways to bring people together. And this is, I think, a good example of it here. And there are many schools that I know that are using games like Mario and Sonic in the Winter Olympics. And Joe, after the break, will talk about an Olympics project, which hopefully we're going to get set up for the 2012, you know, Olympics as well. But it's thinking about how can we use games to bring young people together. So this was an example. Again, it's between sort of Gavin Primary and a school in Canada, right, where the children met together online to discuss the Olympics. Now, some of the children thought maybe that they were discussing Mario and Sonic at the Winter Olympics, but you notice that because of the difference in time zone there, you know, 1 p.m. for Gavin, 6 a.m. for the school in Canada, right, that's a very, very early time. So what did the teacher in Canada do? Well, she slept in the school for the whole of the night with her class, right, and video conferenced around the room, because actually this particular exercise wasn't necessarily about Mario and Sonic at the Winter Olympics. You notice they're wearing pajamas and things in their room, right? It wasn't necessarily about sort of Mario and Sonic at the Olympics, or it wasn't about the Olympics. It wasn't necessarily even about kind of global collaboration. But this was a really, really great exercise for both teachers to introduce the concept of time zones, right, which teachers don't get, or which children don't get sometimes, sorry. Right, so thinking creatively about some of these things, linking it together, you know, and bringing these ideas together in terms of this common language. The children are talking about a common theme, games, for example, in this case, and, you know, retrofitting it to talk about something else. I also think that we as teachers can learn a huge amount from games. Because for whatever reason, young people like playing games, and some would argue actually that some games are addictive. Now, wouldn't it be great if kids were addicted to learning? Right, wouldn't it be great if we could take some of the concepts that are in good computer games and apply that to our classroom practice, apply that to our classroom pedagogy? I think that's really, really important that we think about it. So let's take a skill, right, which arguably some people think, you know, may not be as appropriate as it was once, right, but it's in a lot of exam syllabus, isn't it? Right, young people being competent in Microsoft Office. Right, so what skills or what things could we learn from games, right, to help children know more about Microsoft Office? Well, you may or may not have heard about it, but there's a little plugin that's available now. It's called Ribbon Hero. Right? And with Ribbon Hero, you can download it, And it basically makes the normal kind of tasks that you would expect young people to do in office, or any people to do in office, editing PowerPoint presentations, creating graphs, editing documents in Word, it turns it into a game. It gives you challenges. And the more complicated tasks that you do, the more kind of points that you get. Right? And if you want to, you can compete with other people in your class, or you can compete on an international scoreboard, right, to create the best PowerPoint presentations ever. Right? And to improve your score, it's got tutorials that are built into it as well. Right? Things that you can help learn about. Right? Now, why is this important? Well, because arguably, teaching a young person or any person about Microsoft Office isn't an interesting task. We could debate whether it's an important task or not. It's important because it's assessed in Scotland as part of the examination syllabus. We want children to pass it. So let's take that element of competition, right, and let's help children learn, about some of these things as well. And this is a great teacher from sort of Stirling High School who was one of the first people to kind of, install Ribbon Hero onto his thing. And he was absolutely blown away by how quickly his kids kind of took to it, which I think is important. Now, we wouldn't want to use it all the time, just like we wouldn't want to use games all the time. But anything that we can put in our teacher's toolbox to engage those young people in front of us, I think is incredibly important. So what else can we learn from games? Well, for example, we know that some games kind of always worked. And we might not like Scrabble, right, because Scrabble's basically kind of to do with spelling, but it's a game that constantly sells. Otherwise, they still wouldn't make it. But it's interesting how it's evolved, hasn't it? Right, so this is obviously the kind of traditional kind of Scrabble board game there. It's available on DS. Right? Absolutely fantastic. Put a couple of copies of that in your library, right, see how quickly they get signed out, because as long as they're being signed out, what are the children doing? They're learning spelling, they're playing with words, they're promoting literacy, right, but it's a game. It hasn't got to be books in the library or anything like that. But let's take it a stage further. All right? I don't know whether you've come across this app for the iPhone. All right? Fantastic app. It's called Seek and Spell. All right? And you stand together, maybe there's up to 6 of you, I think it allows, and you can all join the game. Right? And you join the game. It's best to play it in a big open space, by the way. I wouldn't play it inside or anything like that, or near a road. Right? But you join the game, and what happens is, well, letters get superimposed actually where you are, around you, onto the ground, and you can see the other competitors that are there as well. And it's your job to get out and collect the letters, to spell the longest words, to get the biggest points, which then you can kind of submit, and you can compete within your friends. Now, because you can see where the other people are as well, because it's all done through the website and it knows where you are using the phone's GPS, is that if you see somebody going for that E, right, and you really want to get to that E first, it introduces that element of competition for you to go away and for you to collect, those letters as well. And it builds up these points, right, and you can spell the words, and it's the same as Scrabble. If you put 2 certain letters together, you get extra word scores, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, as I said before, you need to be very, very careful where you play it, all right? But, highly engaging, a different way of doing the same thing. Not something to do all the time, but something else maybe to add to your kind of teacher's toolbox, which is important. Now, a piece of software that I like a lot, it's just come out, it's just kind of in the beta stage, is something that's called Story Stage. You may or may not have heard of it. Right, but let's have a think about this for a minute. If we get some children, right, and if we sit them around a computer, and if we've only got one mouse, this tends to be what happens.
Look, it's steaming. Yeah, it keeps on steaming. Right, wait. Leave it. Now we've got. Now from the background.
They tend to argue, don't they? They tend to fight over one. They tend to fight under one mouse. And the conversation isn't about learning and objectives. The conversation is about who's in charge, who's in control. But Story Stage uses multi-mouse, right? And it allows you to connect, in this case, up to 4 USB mice to the same computer, right? So it's introducing that kind of concept of a game again, collaboration, things that we've learnt from the game. And now, the children are doing the same activity. They're concentrating on the learning, and they're concentrating on working together because they can all interact with the interface. In exactly the same way as if you're playing multiplayer games, you can all interact together. If you've got a Nintendo Wii, you can connect, for example, up to 4 different controllers. And you're probably wondering what they're doing. Well, the reason I showed you this example is because I think it links perfectly back into what we were talking about yesterday. It links into the power of story. So those children, they're creating their own version of Goldilocks and the 3 Bears. But it works a bit like a pantomime, right? So unless you've kind of got all 4 of those mice together, then only one curtain's going to be pulled one way or only one curtain's going to be pulled the other way. So it needs to be, again, driven by the narrative. The children direct their story so that when the story starts, when they hit the record button, One child opens the curtain, one child opens the other curtain, one child brings forward Daddy Bear, one person makes the kettle boil, you can speak into the microphone, etc., etc., etc. It's highly collaborative, right, and it's highly planned, but it's using, more technology, but it's learning from games. And of course, the great thing about Story Stage as well is, just like a lot of good games, is it can be, it can be remashed up, right? So we can now start to combine different stories. So we've got Goldilocks and the Three Bears, but what happens when Goldilocks and the Three Bears meets a troll, right, or a wizard? Right, so again, capturing the imagination of children as they kind of develop and as they kind of relate their own type of work. And it's this kind of, real time, this kind of engagement from young people, which I think, is incredibly important. Now, this isn't a game, but it's a simulation, right? And there's a lot of talk about simulations at this conference, and it's a very, very simple form of simulation, right? But it's still equally valid, and it's a fantastic idea, because what the National Archives are doing is they're pretending that the 1st of January 1940 is the 1st of January 2010. And then in kind of comparable real time, they're sending out messages about the rollout of the Second World War linked to actual articles in the National Archive. Now that's absolutely fantastic, because even though it's not actually happening, even though the Second World War actually isn't happening, it creates that kind of suspended disbelief within young people that actually the war, is being rolled out. And I think that's incredibly important, because there are a lot of young people that think that World War II happened in 6 weeks, right, because they haven't got that concept of 4 years, or 4.5 years. And the schools that we suggested that they use from this, they're reporting that the young people are going to this website at home because they're interested to see what happens, right? Because sometimes there's not any updates for days or even weeks, right? Because war's a long, drawn-out process, and it's trying to get these concepts across. And it's with tools like this, with very, very simple simulations like this, that we can start to think about how we change and how we teach things in schools. So wouldn't it be great if instead of teaching World War II over 6 weeks, that we taught it in 4 years? Why not? Why not? Why don't we do that? Why don't we think differently, about some of these things, how we do some of these things? So different ways that we simulate things as well. And here's another example. National Geographic, good example of a simulation. All right, this one's called Jason Mission Center. Uses kind of real-time data which comes in from hurricanes, from storm tracks, etc., and young people can engage, in the content. Because it's real and because it's actually happening, it's very, very important. So my next point then is one about young people creating content, right? And Brian Clark, at the very last session this morning, is going to talk about how we kind of create games and how I think it's really, really important for young people. Because we are, in a little bit of a danger of, I think, creating a whole generation of young people that just consume content but don't also create it as well, which is why getting children to tell their own stories and to remash their own stories, I think is a kind of incredibly important thing. And Brian's going to talk about a number of different packages, but one package in particular that we've been using a lot up in Scotland is something called Kodu, right? And one of the reasons that we use it is because it's free, right? Because it's free and because it's highly engaging. Originally, it was available for the Xbox, but what a lot of people don't know is that now you can also download it for your PC as well. And it's basically very, very simple games design software. It's not a lot of complicated coding in it or anything like that, but it's putting together kind of Lego blocks to kind of create this rich multimedia environment. And Brian will go into more detail about that later on. And because it's for the Xbox, right, and because you can actually connect your controller to the PC as well, which gives the child the feel that they're actually developing something from for the games console, it's highly engaging. You can use the keyboard as well. Right, but there's something about connecting the controller, developing the games for the Xbox that the children kind of really, really like. It's really sort of immersive. And when you make something like many of these new games design pieces of software, it gives you that instant feedback straight away. Right, and children now expect that kind of instant feedback from their teachers and also from other people as well. And you can do these kind of relatively sort of complex tasks. Right? But as well as, I think, getting young people to develop games, I think it's also important to look at these tools differently and think about, well, actually, one of the great things about Kodu and other games design software is I can put speech into it. Right? I can put text into it. And as soon as we can start putting things like text into it, that means it becomes narrative-driven, and that means that these types of computer games can be used to support literacy and other things as well. The other thing that you can do is you can change the variables. So, for example, I can make hills steeper, right? Or I can make them shallower. I can change the friction, or I can change the gravity on certain objects. And obviously, by changing the variables, then this becomes a pretty good tool for teachers to start teaching the sort of the concepts of science, but in this kind of immersive environment as well, an environment that young people, are kind of used to. So games design is very, very important. We'll talk about that. right? But also, you know, how we might be able to use some of these tools to deliver other aspects of the curriculum. And here's quite an interesting one. This is a kind of exercise in sort of recreation here. I don't know if you can see this, kind of like this is a path, right? At the top of the path is a castle, all right? And it's kind of based on this sort of no fort here, all right? But actually, you know, when you look at it from above, right, which was what was given to the children, you can kind of see where the path's coming from, you know, leading up to the fort. You can kind of see, you know, what they've built there and how they've kind of rebuilt their world. And providing structure like that, you know, to get children to start building these games, I think is really, really important, right? Because otherwise they start to get off task. We can't just put children in front of computers and say, make something. But there's got to be that kind of planning. There's got to be that pedagogy. It's got to be driven by the teachers beforehand. And of course, the great thing about all these games is they can be shared. And the fantastic talk from the creators of Little Big Planet yesterday morning, talking about the power of sharing games. By sharing games, that gives children audience. It means that people can comment on these games. By providing audience and comments, you're providing feedback, and they're making real stuff as well. And Porchester Junior High School, there's been a lot of talk about using 2DIY, have got a fantastic bank of resources that they put up online where all their children's games are there, you know, and they can kind of being shared. Absolutely fantastic. And exactly the same for Kodu as well. So my very last point, I'm coming to the end of my presentation, you'll probably be very, very pleased to know, but I kind of wanted to just make this point as well, is that I think it's also important that we teach about games. I need to teach about games. Now, I've got to be a bit careful what I say here, because this is a games-based learning conference when we're advocating the use of computer games, right? But, right, what we need to be careful of is we need to think about the types of games that we're using. Now, for us, this is common sense. Right? We wouldn't use a game like Grand Theft Auto, made in Scotland, by the way, something we're very proud of, all right? You know, in schools, because it's highly inappropriate, right? But my point is, for school leaders, for politicians, for government officials, yeah, when we say the word computer game, that's the first thing that they think about, right? And we need to make sure that we're very, very clear in anything that we do, that we're not talking about games like this. And it's obvious for us, but it's not obvious for people that don't play games. And I mean that point. We've had massive kind of talks about this. Call of Duty, all right? Is it appropriate for school? I don't think so. I don't think that young people that play this, as it was kind of hinted yesterday in one of the presentations, will actually then go away and research about war. I don't think they will. But this is a game about shooting things, all right? It's not, you know, it's not appropriate, I don't think, for the kind of school use. But I think it's also important that we understand where this technology is going. Right, so now, for example, if you play Call of Duty, you can, you know, get a bit of equipment, you can get a vest and a helmet, so that when you're shot in the game, it feels like you're getting shot, right? It feels like you're getting stabbed and all of these things as well. So I'm not advocating this in schools. I'm certainly not, all right? But the point I am trying to make is that, you know, when you start to look at games like this that people are playing, Manhunt, right, where you have to kill somebody with a plastic bag, and when you kind of start to combine that with new technology which is coming out, we think probably in E3, like Project Natal, for example, where people, instead of using joysticks, you know, your whole body, you know, will become the controller, is that I think that I've got a real kind of worry there that there's a huge amount of young people, yeah, that will be playing this type of game, but they're becoming more and more immersive from it as well. And the reason that I'm mentioning this is because I think as teachers, these are the discussions that we need to be having with children. This is an important education issue that we need to be having with children. All right? And why is it important? Because in the past, I think that young people have been very, very easily able to distinguish between what is fantasy and what is reality. Right? But I think in the future, not very many months away, yeah, if you can actually feel what's happening in that game, right, if you can actually act out what's happening in that game, not through an interface, then these boundaries for me become a lot more blurred. Right? And these are the discussions that we need to be having with teachers to make sure that they're kind of well briefed on these issues, to make sure that our young people know distinctly between what are boundaries, you know, and what are blurred boundaries. So just a wee word about the future. We've tried to mention it already. Brian's going to talk about this in terms of augmented reality later on. And the future is kind of augmented reality, how it works. We've been doing a kind of bit of work with Invisimals, which is this idea of, you know, actually putting 3D shapes into the real world. Where's this kind of going? Well, this is a kind of helicopter here. It was produced at the CES show this year, comes commercially available this year. It's controlled by your iPhone, right, or your iPod Touch over a Wi-Fi network. It's got a camera which is built into it. It's an augmented reality game. You can fly this around, right, but you can actually shoot things in real life around it as well. Right? And this technology is under 12 months away. Right, so it's bringing that kind of world of sort of computer games, into the real world as well, in terms of what happens. This is a working prototype at the CES show this year, just in January. I think it's really, really interesting. But obviously, we can take some of this technology as well, right, this whole idea of augmented reality into the nursery school, right, and suddenly clothing becomes augmented, right, and suddenly we can start teaching about the weather, and we can start teaching about the movement. You can buy this, by the way, this is already available. All right? And children can interact with the computer screen, they can interact with the weather, and they can make it rain, and they can catch the raindrops, right? And they can hold the sun, and they can do all of these things as well. So it's very, very important that we think about, how these tools can be used compared to everything else. So we've got some barriers, right, in terms of getting this out into schools, haven't we, in terms of these things. And some of these barriers will be that last point that I made you there, right, about the inappropriate use of computer. And that's why I wanted to make it, right, because it's something that we all need to be aware of, because it's something that we need to kind of sell to our schools in an appropriate way. And it's this one of kind of culture, all right? The other barrier I think that we quite often come across is that, children will misuse technology, they'll misuse the game, all right? And, you know what it's like. When Brian McLaren was at school, right, this is how he used to misuse technology. Right? He used to get his calculator, right, type in 5319009, turn his calculator upside down, right, and it spelt boobies. All right? So children have always kind of misused technology, right? But it's about sort of dealing with that, isn't it? And that becoming part of the learning experience, to make sure things are okay. Right? And there may be some problems with platform limitation as well, access to bandwidth, etc., etc. The other big question that we get is, of course, one of training. Now, my argument with teachers when I'm dealing with training is this. First of all, if you can check your email and you can add an attachment to it, yeah, you can play Nintendogs, even if you've never picked up a DS before, because it's marketed at 3-year-olds. Right? And all of the instructions are actually inside the game. Yeah? The point is that you just haven't bothered trying. Right? Or we've not given you the time to try, in the first place as well. And I think what we need to do, yeah, if we're going to get more of these types of games into school, is really challenge what we mean by professional development. Right, so arguably, this session that we're in this morning is that, we're talking about sort of computer games in schools. It's a great example of what I would call drip feed CPD. So you all come into the room, we talk to you about computer games in schools, we dip you into the CPD, right? You all leave as experts at computer games in schools. And of course, it's complete nonsense, isn't it? Right? And that's why conferences like this are so good, because this session's been recorded and it'll be put up online. All right? We've already told you where the PowerPoint slides and all the links are going to be as well, which means you can then go back and you can kind of graze on this information. You can take the little bits that are important to you and also then kind of adapt it into your own local need. So our biggest challenge then is this, isn't it, with schools? All right? It's making sure that we've got teachers motivated to embrace this kind of games-based technology. So a risky activity, I think, right? A risky activity. But it's interesting because the children that are walking along that cliff path there, yeah, are walking to school. All right? And they have to walk to school every single day in order to get there. And the reason that they have to do that is so they get an education. Right? And I think that our challenge is to think about kind of computer games in school and think about, well, we may be taking a risk using some of these computer games, right? But actually, the end point, getting to the school, is going to be highly motivating for the children, and therefore it's going to really kind of capitalise on learning. So I think we've reached that tipping point. I think this conference is a really, really good example of that, about trying to get more of these types of games in schools, right? But now, all we have to do is do this. And this was my favourite quote from yesterday's conference, right? It really kind of resonated with me, is that only by watering ideas will we find out if there's a weed or a flower. I think games-based learning in schools are flowers, right? But we need people like us, people like you, advocates, of games-based learning, to water these ideas, to help them grow, and to get the best possible experiences for our children. Thank you very much.